Hi, this is Mrs. Rook, and I'm going to read to you a story today called The Wreck That Was Hesperus. It's a story by Morris Walsh, illustrated by Guy Parker. Hesperus, the story of a jalopy. Hesperus was an automobile. He looked more like a wreck. Hesperus lived in a vacant lot right next to Dusty the junkyard. The way Hesperus looked, he might just as well lived in the junkyard. He might be living there today were it not for the kindness of Doc Smith. In fact, Dusty often said to Hesperus, "Why don't you give up and live with me instead of dragging the Bumpkin family and their 13 children to the beach to enjoy themselves? They never take care of you or give you good gasoline to drink." Dusty pointed at Hesperus. "Look at yourself. What a mess." Hesperus looked at himself in the shiny, wet pavement. Tears almost came to his weak headlights. He said, "You're right. I am a mess." Hesperus stared at himself in the pavement. "My paint is peeling until I can't tell which is my paint and which is my body. My top is full of holes, and the rain wets my upholstery. My engine knocks, my steering wheel doesn't turn. Just a mess," Dusty said. "I have no brakes to stop myself. Sometimes a kind tree stops me. Other times the car in front of me has to stop me. Many times Lily the lamppost helps me." Hesperus began to cry. He tried to blow his horn. It wouldn't blow. It moaned. It moaned as if every sound were his last. Now you would think with all these faults, Hesperus would just give up and live in the junkyard. But not Hesperus. He was no quitter. Every Sunday the Bumpkins and their 13 children would get into Hesperus for a quiet day at the beach. First, Mr. Bumpkin would get in. Then would come Mrs. Bumpkin. After that, the 13 children would start to get in. Every time that Hesperus took a look at the line of bumpkins waiting to crowd into him, his engine would start to knock and his bearings began to clatter. But the bumpkins never paid any attention to Hesperus's feelings. They would always go in the same alphabetical order. If they didn't get in this way, they wouldn't fit in, or one of them would be left out. This Sunday, after Mr. and Mrs. Bumpkin were comfortably settled inside, Andy the largest climbed in. Then Bertram sat on Andy's lap. There they are, all trying to get in. Mr. and Mrs. Bumpkin and all 13 of their children lined up to get in, to go for a Sunday ride with Hesperus. Then came Charlie with David on his lap. Next came Edward with his lapmate, Frank. Then George with Howard on his lap. Then Ira and Jerry. The smallest children, Kermit, Larry, and Minnie, squeezed wherever they found a place on the floor. It was the same every Sunday. "We're off," yelled Mr. Bumpkin. But not so fast. No sooner had Bertram sat on Andy's lap when one of Hesperus's tires sank to the ground. By the time Edward got in, the second tire had sunk. As soon as Minnie got in, all the tires had sunk, and poor Hesperus was gasping for breath. The load seemed too much. "This will never do," said Mr. Bumpkin. Mr. Bumpkin climbed out. A took B from his lap, C took D from his lap, E took F from his lap, and each of them picked up an air pump and pumped air into each of Hesperus's tires. After much squeezing and pushing and grunting, The entire family got back in, and Hesperus chugged off to the beach. As soon as they came to a hill, Hesperus started to spit and cough. That was the signal for Mr. Bumpkin and E and F and G to get out and push. When Hesperus finally reached the top of the hill, Mr. Bumpkin, E, F, and G crowded in again, and Hesperus rolled down the slope. "Oh dear," cried Hesperus, "I have no brakes." As soon as the other cars heard the moaning of Hesperus's horn, they all dashed out of the way because they knew Hesperus couldn't stop without brakes. They thought too much of their nice fenders to let poor Hesperus bump into them. When other cars passed Hesperus on the road, they jeered, "Get a horse! Get a taxi!" Poor Hesperus was not very proud when he heard these calls. And very often when the Bumpkins were tired of pushing Hesperus, they did get a horse or a taxi to push. Hesperus was pushed so often, he felt more like a pushmobile than an automobile. There he is being pushed. One day, after poor Hesperus had frozen in the cold during the whole night, he looked at the usual crowd lining up to get in. His engine knocked more than usual. Just the thought of that big family crowding in again was too much for poor Hesperus. "I just can't get on," Hesperus said, and his patchwork tires sagged even before Mr. Bumpkin was able to get in. The whole family tried to pump up Hesperus's tires. They pumped and pumped and pumped. It was no use. The more they pumped, the more Hesperus sagged. Finally, the Bumpkins became disgusted and took a bus. Hesperus was greatly disappointed. When the Bumpkins came back from the seashore, they took another look at Hesperus. They said, "He's no good anymore. Let's sell him." Hesperus knew now that the Bumpkins had no further use for him. He was through as far as they were concerned. What an end. Mr. Bumpkin painted a sign, "For Sale," in great big letters, and put it on Hesperus's hood. People looked at the "For Sale" sign, then they looked at Hesperus, then they looked at the junkyard next door. "What is he doing out of the junkyard?" they asked. It seemed that no one really wanted old Hesperus now. He just stood out there, an old wreck, abandoned by his owners. For a long time, nobody even noticed him. One day, Doc Smith happened to pass by. He looked at Hesperus, then he looked at the crowd laughing at Hesperus, then he looked back at Hesperus. Doc loved automobiles. People called him Doc because he always tinkered with cars and fixed them up. Doc turned to the laughing people and said, "If you ran for 150,000 miles, you'd be tired too. I'm buying him." The people looked ashamed. Some of them were glad that Doc bought Hesperus. Hesperus looked at Doc and honked his horn weakly. "Thank you so much." Hesperus felt happy now when he saw that Doc Smith had bought him. Doc Smith took Hesperus to his steam-heated garage. He cleaned all the cheap gasoline out of Hesperus's tank. He gave Hesperus a long drink of good gasoline and a refreshing pail of water for his radiator. He jacked Hesperus up so that Hesperus wouldn't have to stand on his tired tires. He patted Hesperus on his radiator cap and said, "Don't worry, Hesperus. You're going to be all right." Hesperus began to feel somewhat better already. Hesperus stayed in the garage all week without moving and had a good rest. "I feel grand," he said. "What a pleasure not to have to look at the long line of bumpkins waiting to get in." This certainly was the life, he thought to himself. Resting was so nice. After 1 week, Hesperus was feeling ever so much better. He was even able to see a little out of his headlights. He almost felt like a new car. Then Doc took off his coat and really went to work. He straightened Hesperus's wheels and straightened his steering gear. He changed all of Hesperus's worn-out tires. He tightened every loose part. He oiled Hesperus's chassis. He threw away Hesperus's moaning horn. Hesperus's new horn sang a tune. He painted Hesperus's body with a shiny coat of red paint and put auto wax on him. He gave Hesperus a new set of brakes. My, how Hesperus sparkled, how his new headlights shone. How handsome he looked and how fine he felt. He was almost ready to run. Hesperus tried out his new horn. Da-da-dee-da! Hesperus grinned. "Gee, Doc, this is swell." "Thanks, Doc." "Don't thank me," Doc said gruffly. When Sunday came out of habit, Desperate looked for that long line of bumpkins, but there wasn't any line. There was just Doc and his wife and his 2 lovely children. Hesperus felt as light as a feather. His engine purred. Hesperus was raring to go. He felt great. Doc stepped on the throttle and away Hesperus went. Hesperus didn't just ride. He zipped right past the other cars. My, but they were surprised. No one had to push Hesperus. He could push them. Lily the lamppost blinked her lights. She waited for Hesperus to bump into her, but he didn't. There he is. Hesperus blew his musical horn and stopped easily in front of Lily with his new brakes. She was surprised. "Bravo," Lily said. Lily was happy for Hesperus, and happy for herself, too. No one laughs at Hesperus anymore. They just say, "There goes a great little car." Hesperus is happy.